The crystal lights in the hospital atrium threw small moons across the tile floor and mapped the slow orbit of night staff between waiting chairs and vending machines. The smell of antiseptic and old coffee braided into the air like a bad memory. Maya Torres kept her hoodie cinched tight, as if fabric could stitch her into anonymity, her hands moving through a practiced loop that calmed the tremor in her fingers, a trembling hand that belonged to habit more than cold. She watched the ward doors like someone counting breaths, noting the way the fluorescent panels hummed, the click of rolling gurneys, the distant murmur of a late-shift radio. A nurse closed a clipboard with a soft snap and walked past carrying the scent of lemon sanitizer. A TV in the corner played a muted morning show, color flickering over the linoleum. Maya had not planned to make a call that night, but she had seen the woman before in the visitor's chair, hair powder white, jacket folded over her lap, eyes that had the tired kindness of people who had held families together and never asked to be thanked. Maya had watched a son pace in a suit the first time. Tonight, there was no son. When the night clerk finally left his desk for a cigarette, she lifted her phone, thumb hovering over a number she had learned in pieces from overheard conversations and old news clippings. The number belonged to a man who commanded rooms without being loud, and who had a reputation that made other reputations straighten. Maya swallowed and dialed. Outside, the rain began to scratch at the canopy like a fingernail on glass, a small ceremonial silence that felt like the city holding its breath. The call connected before she could tell herself to hang up, and a voice answered with the kind of calm that had anger folded into it. "Marco Rinaldi," said the voice. Maya said nothing at first, listening to the way his name landed on the line like a ledger being opened. "I need you to listen," she said finally, voice low, each word chosen like a coin to be placed on a table. Marco asked 30 questions in 3 sentences, each precise and wrapped in the kind of courtesy that tested truth. "Who is your mother to him?" he asked. "She is in room 201 and no one is sitting with her," Maya replied. Her mouth had a taste of copper and mint, the coins of a subway ride and the gum she saved for the morning. "She is old," she said. "She loses her watch when she sleeps and calls the nurses by the wrong name." Marco did not ask why the girl knew. Instead, he asked for details, for small evidences, for the color of a blanket, for the cadence of her breathing, as if he were cataloging a ledger that might later be subpoenaed. Maya described a thin scarf with a faded paisley pattern and a gold locket that once swung like a pendulum beneath the woman's collarbone. "Stay there," he said, the words carrying a concession and a command. He promised transport, and for the first time since she had been a child under a roof that smelled of frying oil and arguments, someone offered her a measure of recognition that did not feel transactional. They met in the hospital corridor like 2 actors arriving late for a scene they had haunted separately. Marco came with a small convoy and a silence that filled the spaces he passed through. His consigliere Lena Moretti trailed behind carrying a thermos. She had a quick habit of folding paper maps into her palm. Nurse Patel hovered near the station with a list of medications, eyeglasses low on his nose, the taste of antiseptic still in his mouth from an earlier dose. Maya felt a wash of heat when Marco kept his hand near her elbow, not touching, but close enough that the scent of his cologne was a shadow that threaded through the air. "Who are you?" he asked, in a voice that was less a question than an appraisal. "My name is Maya," she said. "I saw your mother alone." Marco blinked once, the small gesture of a man who was not used to being surprised. "Why did you call?" Lena asked with suspicion wrapped in the softness of a municipal worker who had seen panhandlers and saints. Maya said it was because it mattered to her that someone be with the woman, and because she had once been the one who sat with her own grandmother on nights when no one else remembered to call. Marco's eyes held a flicker of recognition and something like pity. "Sit here then," he said, and the hospital chairs, for a moment, seemed to divide the world into those who could afford attention and those who paid in other currencies. The first tension rose slowly, a moment of breath held and measured. Maya remembered a kitchen table lit by a single bulb when she was 7, a bowl of soup cooling, and the quiet conversation between adults that told a child how a name could endanger a house. She thought of the one time she had been taken to a sterile room as a child, while social workers shied from look and blame, the noise of the fluorescent lights a drumbeat that announced her unimportance. That memory tasted like boiled artichoke and the dust under a bed. The present pressure of Marco watching the ward with an attention that scanned for faces, not files, made her want to flee into the rain. Her muscles remembered how to run. She did not. She stayed because the woman in the chair had reached for a blanket that had slipped, and because a part of her held a ledger of kindnesses owed. She adjusted the scarf around the woman's shoulders, felt the threadbare fabric against her skin, the sound of the plastic wrapper from a glucose tablet in the pocket, the soft rustle as she tucked the blanket tighter. This stillness before the movement was not empty. It was charged like a wire waiting for a current. Every small care, a choice that might be noticed or counted as a threat. The corridor lights hummed a patient, indifferent tune, and the night smelled of rain and disinfectant and distant fried dough. Inside the ward, a surveillance camera rotated on a slow axis, its red light a small, impartial eye. Marco watched the footage on a phone Lena handed him, tilting the screen so Maya could see a grainy figure cross the lobby where a black car had parked. "That is not yours," he said, meaning both the car and the implication. Maya could hear the word surveillance in the back of her skull, as if it had been a drum roll announcing danger. She described the black sedan as best she could, noting a scraped bumper and a license plate with the last 3 digits blurred by a smear of mud, like a secret smudged beyond recognition. Lena pressed her thumb to the screen and scrolled through hospital logs, the sound of the interface a small mechanical whisper that felt dangerously intimate. "Someone has been watching her," Marco said, his voice hollowing into a professional concern. "Is she on any records besides family?" Nurse Patel answered in a crisp, almost academic tone, reading from the chart about next of kin and past admissions, a recitation that felt like forensic testimony. Maya saw the way Marco's shoulders tightened, a man rearranging the pieces of his life into defense. "We need to move her," Lena said, "not to a home, to a place she will not be expected to speak, where no one will look to see if a locket is missing." She said refuge like a noun with a plan attached. Marco nodded, and for the second time that night, gave Maya something more than recognition. He offered alliance. Maya rode in the back of a sedan that smelled faintly of leather and oranges, the windows fogged in a way that made the city a watercolor beyond the glass. Lena drove them to a place that was neither safe nor threatening, a small apartment above a locksmith where the landlord owed Marco favors. The room was spare, the mattress thin, the light warm and forgiving. Theo Alvarez from the shelter arrived with a sack of prepared food and a smile that cracked like safe flame when he introduced himself and said, "You did a good thing tonight." Theo had worked at the city shelter for years and had a habit of counting names on his fingers as he spoke. Mayor Patel sent a text with the password to the hospital archive system so that Lena could pull old admission records, a workflow explained in plain terms so Maya could understand the procedural steps: log in, 2-factor authentication, query by name, and date range, export encrypted PDF. The digital language of evidence had a clunky honesty to it. Maya washed her hands in the tiny sink, felt the water run over skin calloused by street winters, and ate soup that Theo handed her. In that brief refuge, she learned that Marco feared not the law but exposure, that he measured threats by how quickly they could unspool his family legacy. He confessed to an old concession he had made years ago to keep the family safe, a document filed in a bank and kept under lock with a duplicate in an offshore archive. Maya listened and realized that the scale of his life was a ledger as fragile as the locket on the woman in room 201. At the center of their work lay evidence, an archive of small things that could either clear a path or burn it shut. Lena set a laptop on the table and pulled up a trove of hospital shift logs, CCTV timestamps, and an old handwritten note that read like a social stitch connecting names to addresses. "This is what we can prove," Lena said, and she enumerated with the exactness of a court clerk the sequence that would be needed to push an investigation. timestamps, medical records, witness statements, and the digital trail from the hospital visitor kiosk. We have to tie the black car to a registrant and then to the men who reported to a rented storage unit on Canal, she said. Her voice moved from conversational to procedural in a single breath. The plan sounded like an instruction manual for risk. Maya watched Marco's face as he considered each step, the muscles along his jaw calibrating the level of personal exposure. If we feed this to the right channels, Marco said, it will look like concern, not an accusation. Theo asked questions that hit at the limits of legal procedure, and the conversation shifted to terminology that was pared down into simple definitions. Chain of custody, described as a recorded history of who touched a piece of evidence, metadata, explained as the digital fingerprint attached to a file, and encryption as the lockbox technology that needed a password to be opened. The explanation was concise and filled about 300 characters, allowing Maya to understand the stakes as if a map had been held in front of her eyes. The second tension came when a familiar black sedan turned up at a corner cafe, where Declan, a former cop turned private security consultant, had agreed to meet them disguised as a courier. Maya sat inside and listened to the coffee machine hiss, the clink of porcelain, the low murmur of late patrons. Declan tapped his fingers and said, "They tail like shadows. You did right to call." He had the sort of voice that cataloged risks as if curating them. Outside the window the black car idled, a small dark beetle on a rainy street, taillights glowing. Like two patient embers. Maya felt the adrenaline rush in her throat and the memory of a different kind of chase, a boy from her past who had once tried to steal a watch and turned into a man who ran with other men and never came back. She considered running now, heart at the top of her chest, but saw Marco's hands steady on the table, the way he folded his thumb over his forefinger, as if pinching the world into order, and she did not leave. The risk was close enough to taste like pennies and old gum. They discovered the car was registered to a shell company tied to a storage facility by the docks, and from there the path spread like old roots. Marco assembled a small team. Lena, who could move accounts and permissions, Declan, who could read police reports like poems, Theo, who managed people, Nurse Patel, who could secure hospital paperwork, and Sofia Hernandez, a young temp from the records office who could copy a file without asking questions. Each of them had an action that defined them in Maya's mind. Lena folded maps and folded people into plans. Declan whispered surveillance details at a speed that suggested poetry. Theo supplied warmth and soup. Nurse Patel labeled medications and guarded details with quiet authority. Sophia typed until her fingers ached. They formed an alliance that felt precarious because it included both legal and illegal muscles, a band of mismatched instruments tuned to one score. Maya found herself in the center of a web that had been created by a simple act of compassion and a phone call that might have been an accusation. She kept thinking of the woman with the locket and the ledger in Marco's voice, and feeling both the pull of loyalty to strangers and the iron weight of potential betrayal. The third tension happened in the storage unit on a night when the rain had made the docks smell like iron and seaweed. They approached the unit in 2 cars, the sound of their shoes a chorus on the cracked concrete. Marco's plan had been to retrieve any physical evidence and bring it to a safe place where signatures and timestamps could be attached. Maya's hands shook as she pushed open the corrugated door, metal complaining with a metallic sigh. Inside, boxes were stacked like waiting rooms for secrets. The air smelled of oil and paper and the faint ghost of cigarettes. Lena moved with a deliberate grace and found a box taped with duct tape and marked with a name they did not expect. Declan craned his neck and shone a flashlight. "There," he said, and the beam picked out a set of medical envelopes labeled with the hospital logo and a small folded note that read like a confession. Maya felt her pulse as if it were a separate creature trying to escape her chest. She reached for the envelope and felt the paper rasp under her thumb, a sound like a small betrayal. The room held a suspended moment where any sound would have felt like an accusation. Then the lock clicked, and men outside cleared their throats. For a breath, they were all human witnesses to a choice that would determine who was safe and who would pay. Confrontation arrived not in an explosion, but in a conversation arranged to look like a family visitation. Marco requested that the hospital arrange a private meeting with the woman, saying he had come to make amends for forgotten obligations. The room they used had the smell of lemon and a television that looped images of nature documentaries. Marco sat opposite the matriarch, and Maya watched as power and tenderness played like two musicians on the same instrument. The main dialogue was careful and long, a scene of 10 exchanges where words were weapons and also bridges. Marco spoke first with a calm closure. "I am Marco Rinaldi," he said. The woman blinked and then smiled, as if remembering a name in a necklace. "You have the look of someone who knows too many doors," she said. "You have my son," Marco replied, not as a statement, but as an offering. Maya sat there listening to the way the conversation wound between apology and accusation. Lena intervened with facts, naming dates and files, and Sophia passed an envelope across the table, containing proof of past donations and a fingerprinted receipt that tied a visitor to a keyring left months ago. "You chose to leave," the woman said, voice thin but steady. "Not all choices forgive as easily as they are made." Marco took the accusation like a man who had been catalogued and boxed by his own actions. He answered with a memory of a concession he had made decades earlier to protect a child, and with a plea to be permitted the small grace of redemption. The room had the temperature of held breath, and the kind of silence that required someone to fill it. The crisis that folded into consequence was not cinematic in the way of glass crashing and fist swinging. It was quiet and bureaucratic, and therefore almost cruel. Evidence was presented to a hospital ombudsman who had been bought into the scene by Lena's meticulous calls. Records were amended to show a registered next of kin who could legally make decisions, an action that reactivated a small network of protections. Marco made a concession, a public donation to a community clinic with his name attached, and the promise of a fund for caregivers, a visible legacy that could be accounted for. Declan negotiated with a private investigator to watch the black cars and report movements, a concession of vigilance. Maya was offered a formal role as a community liaison between the hospital and shelters, a job with irregular pay but steady paperwork, and a small office with a lock, something she had not known she wanted until she had it. The choices were not clean. There were whispered accusations of betrayal among Marco's associates who felt he had given too much, and there were legal eyes that watched any movement with ceremonial silence. Lena lost a favor with an ally who saw the deal as weakness and took a small grudge back to an accounting ledger. Theo celebrated with soup in the alley behind the shelter, and Sophia cried once in the records room when she thought no one would see. They had made concessions and alliances, and the social stitching of a community had been quietly rearranged. 3 months later, Maya had a thin office and a ceramic mug with an uneven rim that Theo had given her. She filed forms and walked patients to visiting rooms, learned how to translate hospital language into warmth. Her hands steadied, and when she closed a file, she felt a small spark of recognition, as if she had placed a pebble and watched a ripple. 6 months later, there was a modest plaque in the clinic that bore Marco Rinaldi's name, and a line about supporting caregivers, printed in a font that pretended to be cheerful. The woman from the hospital visited sometimes and would take Maya's hand and squeeze it like an old habit revived. Marco came on a rainy afternoon and stood in the doorway watching the clinic buzz. He left an envelope on Maya's desk that contained a list of community members who might need help and a small card with a password to access a donor archive. The legacy was messy and public and carried with it both praise and suspicion. Maya thought of the ledger of kindness and the way a single phone call had rewritten the possible paths for many people. She still slept in a bed that creaked, but each morning the world felt a little less like an accusation. If she had gained recognition, she had also paid in attention and in being watched.
She had found an odd redemptive arc, not pure but serviceable, stitched together from an alliance that included a Mafia boss who learned to keep a donation receipt as if it were a prayer. If you were in Maya's place, how would you react when a stranger's life is in your hands? Would you call someone who scares you, or would you walk away and keep your own shadows small? Write in the comments, "I would confront" or "I would flee," and explain why. The community will pick the most thoughtful ones, and we may read them in a follow-up episode. Now back to the room. The woman smiled at Maya and said softly, "Sometimes courage is small and necessary." The phrase settled in Maya like a key in a door, and she kept it. In the end, the concession was that nothing was fixed perfectly. Marco paid fines and audiences lectured him about performing philanthropy. Lena lost a line of credit and won a sense of moral admission. Declan received a small hush for a favor he had asked, and Theo received a grant for soup supplies. Sophia received a reference and a job that kept her hands busy and her conscience quieter. Maya received paid time to take a night class and enough hours to keep the clinic open on weekends. The rude machinery of power and law ground slowly, but the small human acts had consequences that were tangible and sometimes contradictory. On a summer evening, Maya stood by the clinic window, watching rain turn streetlights into a river, and thought about the woman who had kept a locket and the magnitude of small mercies. She had made a choice, and it had cost, and had given. Months passed, and the city forgot the small scandal that had rustled through its papers, as cities do, folding stories into the fabric until only a seam remained. On a late afternoon, Maya walked past the hospital, and the woman waved from a courtyard that smelled of jasmine. Marco drove by and tips his head, as if acknowledging not a transaction, but a debt repaid in imperfect installments. Maya touched the locket that the woman had given her in gratitude and felt its cool weight. Sometimes redemption was a single thread of truth pulled through a messy social tapestry, and not the untangling of everything. As she walked home under a sky cleaning itself with rain, she felt recognized and wary and oddly steady. The city continued its commerce of secrets and kindnesses, and Maya kept calling people when they were alone because she had seen that even small acts could reroute a life. The story ended with a small image of a waiting chair, a cup of coffee cooling on an end table, and a thin file in an office drawer labeled Community Liaison, and beneath it a single handwritten note that read, "Keep watching and keep giving your answer to the moment you are given."